following is a talk that I'm about to give here in Rav Teitelbaum Shul. The event is the Tu B'Shvat annual Simcha.
It's a very special schus to have been asked by the Rav Shlita to speak at this first Simcha, the first Tu B'Shvat get-together in our Beis HaKnesses. Rabbi Moshe, thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it. My mother, who is here, she's really the one who deserves all the recognition, and I acknowledge her publicly. A number of years ago, I had the schus to be in Eretz Yisrael on Sukkot. And as many of you know, that when I go to Eretz Yisrael, I try to see as many of the Rosh Yeshivas and the Gedolim that I can. And I usually take my family members, and we were sitting one night with Rabbi Elia Baruch Finkel. Rabbi Elia Baruch is one of the Rosh Yeshivas in Mir. And he told me a very, very delightful story. He told me that many, many years ago, when he was yet a bocher, there was an American fellow who came from the Midwest, who came to learn in the Mir Yeshiva. And this fellow was in Mir for 2 years, and then he decided he was going to go back to America. So Rabbi Baruch said to him, "You're going back to America after 2 years, perhaps maybe you want to get a bracha from some of the Gedolim before you go back to America." And he said, "For sure, I would love to go to Rav Chatzkel Levenstein, the Mashgiach of Panovich, but I don't speak Yiddish. So I would love to go, but if you go with me, I'll be very happy to go." So Rabbi Baruch said, "Of course. You spent 2 years here in the yeshiva, I'll be happy to go with you." So they decided to go on Yud Daled Adar. Yud Daled Adar, of course, is Purim in Bnei Brak, but in Yerushalayim it's not, because in Yerushalayim it's Tezvov. So they had a day off, so to speak, so they came to Rav Chatzkel. So Rabbi Baruch spoke in Yiddish, of course, and he wanted to introduce who this fellow was to Rav Chatzkel. So he said to him, "The Bocher do gelernt in mir 2 Jahr, und geht zurück to America, and will have my bracha." So Rav Chatzkel understood, so he turned to the boy, not realizing that he really doesn't understand Yiddish, and he said, "Nu, mit was gehst du zurück?" So the boy said, "Elal." Rav Chatzkel couldn't believe it. He said, "Nein, ich mein, was nimmst du mit?" He said, "Rebbe, 2 suitcases." So Rav Chatzkel was not this type of person who really had any patience for this, until, of course, Rabbi Baruch explained to him what the muvan of the question was, and of course that he explained that he had learned to Sidorim or Gemara, and of course Rav Chatzkel gave him the bracha. So that Friday night, when I was speaking in a shul in Eretz Yisrael, I told over this story. And a Talmud Chacham there, right after that little drasha that I gave, showed me a Meiri and brachas that's mamish mavel al arayin, and is written for us tonight. The Meiri and brachas, right in the beginning, writes, "Sheyizboinein bizmanim hamiyuchodim." Every single person has to take an introspection and think about the unique times in his life. Mahi sibas hisyachei sumaha yoim miyamayim. Why is this day different than any other day? And the Meiri goes on to explain, if somebody goes through a simcha, or chas v'shalom etzora, he goes through an illness, or somebody goes through a yontif, whatever experience a person goes through, he has to think for a moment, why did Hashem allow me to go through this experience? What can I take with it? And how am I going to be changed because of it? And he writes a very interesting pshat in a pasuk that we all know, but it's a very unique taich that the Meiri gives it. The pasuk is Eis Lasais Lashem Heiferu Torasecha. And the way he teiches it, Eis, every moment that a person goes through, every experience, Lasais Lashem, you have to think what you can accomplish for HaKadosh Baruch Hu having gone through that. If not, then you've destroyed the Torah, you've destroyed the Eibishter's opportunity for allowing you to go through that. And he says that if a person goes through Pesach and eats matzah, and sits in the sukkah and on Sukkot, and he doesn't learn and take something with him forever from that particular Yom Tov, he said he's just like the Chamor. The Chamor carries wheat in the wheat season, barley in the barley season, grapes in the grape season of life. There's all the Chamor. So just because you go through different motions and different types of the year, doesn't make you a different person. If a person doesn't change because of an experience, so he's like the Chamor. So if that's the case, we have to ask ourselves, this Tu B'Shvat and this Tovshin Samachay, why is it special? What are we going to take with us? Is there anything to take with us on Tu B'Shvat? What is Tu B'Shvat? Why have we come together here? What can we learn? How are we going to change that this Tu B'Shvat will change something within us so that for the rest of our lives we'll be able to take something with it? Well, for me and for my dear friend here, Rabbi Yisrael Teitelbaum, the brother of the Rav, these days are very, very special. We'll never forget them. Because today was Shruli's birthday and tonight is my birthday. So Tu B'Shvat, and if those of you who remember, Pashas Yisroi, Shuli, this year it's Yisroi again. That Yisroi in the first minyan, I had my bar mitzvah, Shuli had his bar mitzvah the second minyan. So a birthday is something special. So Tu B'Shvat means something to me. But what does it mean for everybody else? So in a Chassidish Eifen, first we could say, the Bnei Yissaschar has a very interesting kasha, and he gives an interesting Chassidish teretz, but the kasha is a legitimate kasha, even if you're not a Chassid. And he asks the kasha in the first Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. It says, Be'echad B'Shvat Rosh Hashanah le'ilon. Be'echad B'Shvat, the first day of Shvat is Rosh Hashanah for the tree. It doesn't say le'ilonos, like the other Rosh Hashanahs that it talks about in the Mishnah, where they're all Lashon Rabim. K'divrei Beis Shammai, B'tzil Elohim, B'tu B'Av, B'tu B'Shvat, B'chamisha B'Shvat. So the question the Bnei Yissaschar asks, why is it Lashon Yachid that it's a Rosh Hashanah le'ilon? It should have said that it's a Rosh Hashanah for trees, le'ilonos. So he has a very interesting teretz, and he says le'ilon is referring to that special tree that the Torah refers to. What is that special tree? That's the Pri Eitz Hodar. And he says there's a Kabbalah by Chassidish Yidden that tomorrow on Tu B'Shvat it's a special inyan to be mispalel, that a person should be zoicha to have a beautiful esrik. And he says, Ki hinei zeh hayoyim asher ola hasorof be'ilonos. This is the day that the sap goes into the trees. V'zeh remez hatana ba'omer loshin yochid le'ilon lahoyreis ala ilon hamayuchad hamavur b'torah l'mitzvah. That tree, Rosh Hashanah le'ilon, the special inyan tomorrow to daven that a person should be zoicha for a special esrik. Fine. So that's a day of davening. But perhaps it's more than that. Not merely a day of davening for the day for a special esrik. We know that there's a famous pasuk in the Torah that Balei Musar take a segment of this pasuk and have tremendous machshavas, and so much is written. But first, let's just see what the pasuk means. It's important to know the pshat, and then we'll talk to the drush on it. In Dvarim Chav pasuk Yotes, it tells us that if Klal Yisrael is going to fight a war, and they come into a city, and they're going to kill out the people in the city, they have to be careful. However, lo yishashchis es eitza, do not destroy the trees. Lindoyach olav garzen, to swing an axe on it. Ki mimenu toichal, because after all you eat from the trees. V'oisei lo tichrois, ki adam eitz hasada. Is a tree going to fight? It's really a kasha in the pasuk. Ki adam eitz hasada is a tree, somebody that's going to battle. So what are you knocking down the tree for? It can't hurt you anyway. It's not in the war. However, we all know that starting from the Sifri, on that pasuk in Dvarim Chav Yotes, it tells us, Ki ha'adam eitz hasada shechayev, the life, shel adam min ha'ilon. The life of a person can be learned from a tree. That's the pshat, Ki ha'adam eitz hasada. So obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is roots. Just like a tree has roots, we all have roots, we all come from parents and grandparents. It's obvious that we all come from, in a sense, seeds and roots, just like a tree does. The second thing that's obvious is fruits and berries. Just like a tree gives off fruits, a person, Mit Hashem, has children and grandchildren. A person's deeds can be called his fruits. So that's also how Ki ha'adam eitz hasada. But I saw in a certain Musa Sefer, Gavaldik the hair, and he says as follows, perhaps there's another lesson on Tu B'Shvat, Ki ha'adam eitz hasada. A person walks out in the street tonight, in the middle of a snowstorm, You walk out, this past Shabbos I was in Chicago, I didn't even think I'd be able to get back here, there was such a blizzard. You walk out and you see the trees, they're withered, they're dry, you never even think that they're going to come to life again. If a person were to come into the world first and take a look at the trees the way they are now, no leaves, nothing, they're withered. What's going to be the future? But the teretz is that Dafka on Tu B'Shvat, when the trees look so bare and the trees look so empty, then the sap begins to flow within the tree, and once the sap goes in, eventually it begins to nurture, and then all of a sudden the tree comes to life. So a person has to know we all go through different matzavim in life. Sometimes we ourselves are withered. We have no enthusiasm for mitzvahs. We're not lazy when it comes to learning. We're not interested in helping somebody else, and we're withering. And we feel this. Today a fellow called me. He said, I have to come to you and I have to learn with you. I'm going through a midlife crisis. I just feel I'm stagnating. And people do go through that. So a person looks at Rosh Hashanah, and he has to know that a person goes through a time of withering, a lack of enthusiasm. But he has to know that this is a time of infusion. And now the Bnei Yissaschar tells us something which is mamish hafla. Most people wouldn't even have thought about this. And he writes like this: B'tchilas chodesh Shvat, in the beginning of the month of Shvat, hischil levayer es haTorah b'sefer Mishnah Torah. This is the month. You take a look in the Torah and Dvarim Aleph Pasuk Gimel. In the month of Shvat, when Moshe Rabbeinu realized, of course, that this is his last speech, and he realized that all those that were going to die in the Midbar already died, and now he has to give the final instructions for these people that are going to go into Eretz Yisrael. When did he decide to do it? Rosh Chodesh Shvat. Shvat is the time when Moshe Rabbeinu gave the final instructions. Hoyil, the pasuk tells us, Moshe Be'er es HaTorah Hadois. This is a time of Torah. This is a time of the generation that's going into Eretz Yisrael to get their guidance. And it's hafla, as we're going to see later. The Shapurna writes, what did Moshe Rabbeinu tell them? Hoyil levayer mashachoshav sheyipo boisofek achamoisai. He came to be Mavayat Sveikus. Moshe Rabbeinu knew that his time was limited, and he had to be the Manigador. What does a Manigador do? He's Mavayat Sveikus. He gives them guidance. He's the Einei Ha'eda. And this is the month that this happened in. So this is the month that all of us, Maisa Avos Simul Abonim, we have to think of what the Torah is telling us. It's a time of introspection. Hopefully we're the door of Mashiach. And if we are the door of Mashiach, we're going to carry this message to Mashiach. So just like Moshe gave final instructions in Shvat, we perhaps have to get some instructions and think about ourselves. How are we preparing for our entrance to Eretz Yisrael, hopefully with Mashiach? And so I want to share with you a story before I tell you a tremendous, tremendous insight from Rabbi Chaim Volozhiner. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be in Eretz Yisrael. And I went for the first time to Rav Meir Soloveitchik, that's the son of Rav Elvel. Rav Meir is his youngest son. I've seen Rav David many times. My son-in-law learned by Rav David. So many times I had the opportunity to be by Rav David, but the first time by Rav Meir. And I told him that this past summer I had Agmas Nefesh, because I was in Poland, and the last day of the trip we were supposed to go to the kever of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik and the Netziv in Warsaw. Rav Chaim Leiser was with us, and what happened was, unfortunately, the bus had a blowout, and it wasn't dangerous because there's 16 tires on a bus, so if one has if a tire has a blowout, obviously you can't move well, so therefore we couldn't get to Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, and davening by the Netziv was one of the highlights that I was looking forward in the whole trip. So I happened to mention it to Rav Meir. So Rav Meir says to me, he says, let me tell you a story that happened to the Zayda in Varsha. He says, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, he came from Brisk. So in Brisk, every time when he walked into the Beis Medrash, he sat down and people would come over to him and they would start learning. They would talk to him and learning. But in Poland, there are a lot of Chassidish people. And Chassidish people have a different approach to the Rebbe. And many times a Chassid just stands and looks at the Rebbe. And he just watches him breathe. And he doesn't do anything. He's just looking at the Rebbe. And people came into shul in Varsha where Rav Chaim was, and they were staring at him. And they're just staring and looking at him. And after a while, he couldn't take it. He said, first cook there. Like, what are you looking at? What's there to look at here? So the Chassidim said, Rebbe, steht, als man guckt auf a Tzadik, kann man werden a größere Yershamayim. If you look at it, so he said on the spot, Rav Chaim, he said, steht va'amech kulam tzadikim, guckt auf sich allein, it's very größere Yershamayim. But there's a great lesson in that. There's a great lesson va'amech kulam tzadikim. What does that mean? That we should look at ourselves? That we have to look into ourselves and see if we understand what's going on in this world, if we understand what we are doing to prepare our children and grandchildren for a future generation. And when we talk about doubts, every thinking person, man, woman, yid, or lahavdil, not a yid, every person, it has to be disturbed at one point or another since the last 2 months with the tsunami. How does it happen? Why did the Rebbeinu Shalom make that happen? And the truth is that a Yid, more than anyone, is mechuyev to think about it. Because the Gemara says, "Beferish in Yevamos Samach Gimel Amud Aleph, ein peronius bala olam ela b'shvil Yisrael." If a catastrophe comes, punishment comes, it comes only so that we should learn from it. So whatever the magnitude was, and I don't know if you read, but still every day they are finding 2,000 more bodies in Indonesia. So the count is almost 200,000. It's not to be imagined. It's over 200,000. So what in the world? How could such a thing happen? Why did the Eibishter make it happen? And I believe that until a Navi comes, nobody will be able to define it. You need a Navi to define it in its entirety, to say why it happened and the magnitude. However, I do believe that there's a great lesson that we can learn from it. And that lesson, when I think about the image, the most striking image that I saw, the image as many of us certainly saw, the water coming like a wave, a 30-foot wave over the beach, and children and parents playing on the beach, and the water just sweeps them away, and they're gone forever. And as you're watching the people being swept on the wave, all of a sudden one guy is able to hoist himself up, and he holds onto a tree, and he's saved. The water is flying underneath him, everybody is verflated. He is saved because he held on to that tree. So then, it occurred to me, if that's the case, I should look at this Mishnah. Take a look in the Mishnah of Yisvav Pasuk Zion. Gedola Torah Shehina Isenes Chaim Moiseh. Torah is great because it confers life on those who practice it. Ba'olam Hazeh, Ba'olam Haba, and it mentions the famous Pasuk, Eitz Chaim Hilam Achzikim Bo. Somebody who holds on to that Torah, that's the Eitz Chaim, he's going to have Chaim. So I want to read you. You will not believe what Rav Chaim Volozhiner writes on this Mishnah. It's as if he was living today. Listen to what he writes in Ruach Chaim, of Yisvav, Mishnah Zion. Ki ha'olam yam zoyev. This world is a raging ocean. V'galov soyarim, and the waves are storming. La'adbiyah, to sink us. B'metzulois ha'taivas, in the depths of taiva, of desires and ambitions. Ei chaboli notzel, somebody wants to be saved from those waves of secularism, immorality, and materialism. Then oiches ba'etz ha'chayim hi ha'torah. The only way to be saved is just like that person. And that's what we have to learn. One of the lessons, obviously it's not the defining lesson, but just like in the tsunami, one person could see thousands being killed and falling by the waysides. All of us have to know that every day there are people falling by the wayside. Whether they have the internet, whether they travel the streets, everybody has different excuses for having everything. We don't live in a ghetto. We're exposed to it all. And if we're exposed to it all, we have to know that there are waves ready to verflate so many of our brothers and sisters and so many of the children in Klal Yisrael. And the only way to be saved is the Eitz Chaim Hilam Achzikim Bo. And that's by holding on to the Torah and holding on to those that are Mazik Torah. And part of being Mazik Torah is holding on to the Gedolei Torah. Now I just want to tell you, I have in my notes that Gerosha that the Rav mentioned, because I remember that day in 1957. I was 12 years old. I can still picture the Kapishn Rebbe. That was the first time that I saw him. I remember he came and we all went out to the backyard, and they had some cement and they put out the Even Apina, and he was there, and then everybody came in back into the small base medrash. So let me tell you the first part of Rabbi Yankov Teitelbaum's drasha that day. And the reason that I remember it is not from that day. I'll tell you a little secret. I remember it from years later when he said it once Shalashudas. I'll never forget, my father Shalom once told me, he said, Rabbi Teitelbaum says such beautiful things every Shalashudas. You know what would be nice if you would do? Why don't you go every Shalashudas, you'll listen to what he says, write it down, and then at the end of the year you'll give him a gift, everything that he said. He will love it forever. So I did it for 1 week, because there was so much. But that week is the drasha that he said. The same drasha that he said on Lag Boimer that day. So listen to this drasha. It's a hafladika drasha, I never forgot it. He quoted some sefer that says, the Gemara in Shabbos Lamed Gimel tells us that after Rab Shimon Bar Yochai came out of the cave, so he said that now that the Eibishter did a nest for me, so now maybe I could accomplish something for the world. So what would you think that Rab Shimon Bar Yochai was so grateful he was with his son in the cave, and the Eibishter gave him life for all these years, and he was able to learn, and he was just existed on Bab Charuvin. So what did he do? So Rav Teitelbaum asked, you quoted the Chassam Sofer. It says that there was a place, Ika Duchter, there was a place, the Isbei Sofik Tumah, they weren't sure if there was Tumah or not, the Islay Tzara LaKoyanim, and the Koyanim had to walk around the field because, you didn't know if somebody was buried here. So Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, with his Neviah, so to speak, or with his insight, or with his Koyach HaTorah, he was able to figure out where the Mason were buried, and the Mason Daka came up to the ground, so he knew, so like this, that he saved the Koyanim at Tircha, they didn't have to walk around. So some Sefer asked, that's what he had to do after 12 years? What was the accomplishment over here? After all, he wanted to do something for the world, just like Yankov did, the Gemara tells us. Listen to the teretz. Dehine, this is what Rav Teitelbaum said. Masha muter u'masha aser harei kosem b'Torah. You don't need a gadol to tell you what's right and what's wrong. What's black and white, everybody knows. Everybody knows what's muter, everybody knows what's aser. V'chol Yisrael yodim zos. Avo mani gador. Sometimes you have to have that gadol by the sofek tumah. When you don't know that something could end up, well, how is it going to be in 5 years from now? You think if I get involved in this project right now, nothing wrong will happen. No, but the gadol, he sees, that's the sofek tumah. The Chassam Sofer says that it was symbolic what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was doing. He was being mavar for Klal Yisrael, the sfeikus. That's what we learned before. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu was telling us in Chodesh Shvat. What are the sfeikus? That's what you need a gadol for. And every single one of us, just like Rav Teitelbaum always used to tell us about Rav Meir Arik and the Chavetz Chaim and Rav Meir Shapiro, all those that he learned by. He always said that he was the tzinar of all those gedolim for all the previous generations, and that's what we got from him. And that's what every person has to make a Kabbalah. Every person has to have a Rav, a Rebbe, or a Rosh Hashiva that they feel is connected through the generations before the Das Torah. Not that a person paskins on his own. And I'll tell you something, an amazing story. I just heard this story in Chicago this past Shabbos. It's Mavel al Arayan. You see, what's the pshat an Adam Gadol with insight? What's the pshat an Adam Gadol, the Einei Ha'eda? Now, everybody, of course, has their own gedolim. Everybody goes to different yeshivas. Everybody has a different chassidish geza. So it doesn't make a difference. But it's a gadol that's the Einei Ha'eda. So I want to tell you this amazing story. In the yeshiva that I spoke, a place called Beis Medrash LaTorah, Rab Tzvi Kamenetsky, that's Rabbi Yankov's grandson, he's the mashgiach. And he told me an amazing thing. He was married, he lived in Chicago. Those of us from Kibbutz Agudas, Julie Obam's son-in-law, Yehuda Obam's son-in-law. So they didn't have children for a number of years. Finally had a little boy. And the little boy was born prematurely. And the boy was born with a lot of problems. And the hospital took care of this child with such a diligence that it was absolutely remarkable. The baby was there literally more than 3 months until he was able to have his bris. They named him Yaakov, so that's Yaakov Kamenetsky. Fine. Right before Tzvi Kamenetsky was going to leave the hospital, he felt that he owed a debt of Hakoras HaToiv to the people in the hospital, the nurses, the doctors. They were extraordinary. So he didn't know what to buy them. What should you buy them? Candies or pens or a gift? Well, what do you buy doctors? So what does a younger man do? He calls his Rosh Hashiva. So he called up El Yeshvei in Philadelphia. So Rabbi Elia listens to everything that happened, and Rabbi Elia tells him, take out a Chumash Shmois. I want to show you something. Takes out a Chumash Shmois, and he says, let's read these psukim together. In Shmois Aleph Pasuk Kof, and Shmois Aleph Pasuk Chof Aleph. It says like this: Vayitav Elokim Lamiyaldos. The Eivishter benefited the Miyaldos, Shifra and Pur, Yocheved and Miriam. And then the next pasuk tells us, Vayas lahem botim, he gave them botim kahuna, botim levi, as we know. Kahuna levi from Yocheved and Malchus from Miriam. But in the middle, the Torah is adding a few words which don't seem to fit here. It says, Vayitav Elokim Lamiyaldos, the Eivishter benefited the Miyaldos. Then it says, Vayirav ha'om vayatzmoi, they increased and the nation got strong. And then when the Eivishter saw that the Miyaldos feared Hashem, Vayas lahem botim. What is that thing in the middle, Vayirav ha'om vayatzmoi, that they became strong? It's got nothing to do with how the Eivishter benefited them. Zok Rabbi Yeshvei, no, you're making a mistake. That is the greatest benefit that the Eivishter could have done for Shifra and Pua. To show them, Vayirav ha'om, you delivered these children, they got strong, and they're thriving. Zok Rabbi Yeshvei to Tzvi Kamenetsky, don't buy him any gifts. Don't buy him any gifts. That's not what they want. But every year on this little boy's birthday, bring him back to the hospital and show them that the boy got strong and he's doing well. Tzvi Kamenetsky told me he couldn't believe it. His shaila was not whether he should buy. His shaila was what should he buy. And now Rabbi is telling him don't buy anything. You ask a shaila, you can't go against the shaila, right? So Eric Taka didn't buy, he felt awful. But he thanked them profusely, and every single year on the birthday, he brought little Yaakov Kamenetsky, he brought him to the hospital. 3 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old. After 7 years he stopped, but then when it came to the bar mitzvah, he decided he's going to bring him again to the hospital. He brings him to the hospital a few weeks before the bar mitzvah, and then he sends in an invitation to the whole staff, and he sends them a beautiful note with thanks. So I want to read you now the letter that he got back from one of the nurses after he sent the bar mitzvah invitation. My name is Jody. I'm a nurse in the high-risk nursery at St. Francis Hospital in Evanston. As you well know, your nephew had an extended stay in the nursery some years ago. Your son. After finishing nursing school, she writes, she just came to the hospital a few years ago. In orientation, they used to talk about Yaakov Kamenetsky. Could you imagine? They don't even realize who they're talking about, but okay, fine. So in the Goyish orientation, they're talking about little Yaakov Kamenetsky, about his amazing, how special a patient he was, not only because he had such an amazing first few months, but because of how wonderful your family is. Everyone spoke how wonderful it was to take care of the baby and be updated on the child's progress. He was bringing, then after the invitation, she writes, it touched my heart and it reminded me why I became a nurse in the infant's intensive care. Now she writes like this: I wanted you to know how much we appreciate what you wrote and what you have done. Candy and flowers are a nice sentiment, but what you and your family did is something special and helps us make it through the rough days. Isn't that unbelievable? She writes, candy and flowers is a nice sentiment, but that's not what it's all about. Who would believe it? Who would believe it? If you would say, if the Rosh Hashiva would tell you that, you would say, Mustami said he's insensitive. That's goyim, that's why he doesn't want to give. And you would have all kinds of excuses. But obviously he saw something that none of us could have seen. I want to tell you another thing that happened to me. It's not easy to talk about, but it's something that gave me an hadracha in life. I'll never forget that, of course, the people who have been here many years remember when my father, Shalom, was very sick. He was 47 at the time. So, of course, when you're 21, you think 47 is an old man. But when you get past that age, you realize how young 47 really is. So I remember, he was very, very sick, and my brother Kalman and I went to Washington Heights for Shabbos Bar Rav Schwab, because my father was in one of the hospitals there in Manhattan. And we went after Musaf to see my father, and then when we came back by the Suda, Rav Schwab, who knew my father well, because Rav Schwab was a Rebbe in Ner Yisrael before he came to Washington Heights, and my father knew him from Ner Yisrael. So Rav Schwab asks me, he says, Nu, how's your father? I'll never forget. So I said to him, I have betochen that he's going to be well. He got very serious, and he said to me as follows: betochen doesn't mean that your father's going to get well. Betochen means that there's a master plan, and hopefully someday you'll be able to understand it. He understood how sick my father was. And he understood that people think sometimes that betochen means everything's going to be good. Not everything is going to be good. We know in life there's not everything happens is good. But that doesn't mean that a person loses betochen. Betochen means that there's a master plan. That the Eibusha understands that this is for the best, even though you can't feel it and understand it. And of course, a few weeks later, my father was nifter. But that lesson of betochen, when a person has shaykhs to a gadol, all of a sudden you get einei ha'eda. You get a view that you didn't think about before. Tell you one more story. What's the pshat einei ha'eda that's not to be believed? There was a fellow who learned with his son every afternoon in Parnovich, 2 hours a day. He was a businessman. He would come in and he would learn in Parnovich with his son. One afternoon, the mashgiach in one of the yeshivas tells me the father comes into the hallway in Parnovich and he sees a whole tumult. And he sees that they're avoiding him. And nobody wants to include him in the conversation. They're avoiding him. And he knows he sometimes, you get this sick feeling that something has to do with you. And he goes over, he says, Rabbi Paysach, what's going on? And they say, we just don't know how to tell you this, but your son was hit by a bus during lunchtime. He went outside in the street for whatever reason, and maybe he crossed between two cars. I don't know, nobody knew exactly how it happened, but Nebuch was hit by a bus and he's in the hospital. Of course, the guy ran to the hospital, and he ran to see his child, and the doctor told him, you should know that your son is lucky he's got broken ribs, but the impact of the bus hitting your child was so strong that he could have slammed his head on the concrete, he would have had a concussion, he could have been dead. But you're lucky he's going to live. So of course it took him a few days until he could get to himself, the father and especially the son. And then the father decided that he has to ask Rav Chaim Kanievsky what he should do, how he could show Hakaras HaTov to the Rabbeinu Shalom for saving his child. So he sends a shliach because he didn't want to leave his son in the hospital. Listen to what Rav Chaim tells him. Rav Chaim says to him, you should know, the Eibush that gave your son life, you are mechuyev now to give life to someone else. How do you give life to someone else? So Rav Chaim says that you're having a big yeshiva in Parnovich and any other place. Sometimes you have boys that are falling between the cracks. Because after all, in a big yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshivas or the Mashgiach, they can't really keep an eye on everyone. What you should do is that you should pay a young man or pay an elder Rebacha to learn with one of these kids that's falling through this tracks. And when you help this kid learn, you're giving him life. What life is there greater than the life of Torah? And when the father heard this, he literally fainted. Why? Because he had just paid for this type of tutor. And he had written out 5 head checks for the younger man. And the first check was due. That was the day of the kid's accident. So he had given life. That's why he was zeicha to life. But who would ever think that? Who would ever think that that's the reason? That that's the midah keneged midah, that a person is supposed to give life in such a way. But when you have shaykhs to gedolim, then all of a sudden you see things in a different light. So I just want to quote one thing from Rav Matisyahu, a brilliant Einfall that he said in a medrash. We'll end with a story and one more thought. Rav Matisyahu once quoted a medrash Rabbah Vayikra. Omer Rabbi Akiva, Nimshlu Yisrael la'oif. Klal Yisrael is like a bird. Just like a bird cannot fly without wings, Kach Yisrael ein yecholim lasos davar chutz mizikneihem. Klal Yisrael can't do anything without their gedolim. Zekenim zeshakona chochma. So Rav Matisyahu says, what is the muvan? What is the meaning of this medrash? And he said, a bird can move without wings. A bird can walk on the floor. The bird can walk in the field without wings. The medrash is telling us the bird cannot soar. The bird cannot fly. The bird cannot reach great heights without its wings. That's the pshat, what the gedolim are. Of course we can exist without gedolim. But you'll never soar. You'll never reach heights. You'll never reach the highest potential without the gedolim. That's the pshat. Ma'ha'oif hazeh eni poireach v'lo kenafayim. Kach Yisrael en yecholim lasos davar chutz mizikneihem. So I'll just end and tell you, once by Chassidish Rebbe, the Ziddish Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchok Isaac, was Tu B'Shvat, and they all sat by the Rebbe eating peiros. That was the minhag. Each one would take from the peiros of Eretz Yisrael. They would make a bracha Rishayna, bracha Achreina, and say Divrei Torah, psukim that had to do with that fruit. But one time by the Ziddish Rebbe, there were so many people that they ran out of fruit. So the Rebbe's sitting up at the head of the table, and there's no more fruit on the table. And everybody's looking at him, so he says like this, Rabbi Paysach, you want to have fruit? I'll give you fruit. He tells him the whole Mishnah, and then he says, that's the greatest Paris. He says, Rabbi Paysach, if you undertake to learn Torah, if you undertake to do everything that the Torah wants from you, that's the greatest of Paris. Those Paris you'll never run out of. We come tonight to B'Shvat. As Rav Moshe mentioned, in the last 50 years of this Beis Medrash, when Rav Yaakov Teitelbaum started this Beis Medrash, we were zeicha to see in this Beis Medrash great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, children, and grandchildren, literally dairais. And one of the most memorable things that ever happened to me in this Beis Medrash, if I lived to be 120, I will never forget it. That night when my father, Shalom, called Rabbi Yaakov Teitelbaum, and somebody wanted to make a Pirchei Minyan. And they said, a Pirchei Minyan, there's Pirchei Minyanim all over. Why can't you gardens have a Pirchei Minyan? Where the men daven here and the boys will daven someplace else. They'll be able to lay, they'll be able to daven. I'll never forget what the Shabbos we were sitting in the kitchen, and my father asked Rabbi Yankov, and he says, Rabbi Yankov will do whatever you want. You just tell me, what do you want? He says, Chas v'shalom. There will never be a boy separate minyan in our shul. And my father said, Torah higaluman hanitzarech. And he said, you know why? Balashtate, what did Moshe Rabbeinu say? Binu ureinu uvizkeineinu nelech. A Yiddish community is children and parents. That's why in our shul never has been and never will be us boys separate minyan. You want your kids to learn how to daven, come to the first minyan. That's where we all learned how to daven. That's where we all learned how to lane. That's the training grounds. And that's what this shul is all about. Chazal tell us, in ve'agefen ve'in ve'agefen, dovano miskabel. I once heard a fabulous word. Why do we say in ve'agefen ve'in ve'agefen? What's wrong with orange groves and apple trees? What's up is gefen? So I heard a great word. What bracha do you make on an apple? What bracha do you make on a tomato? But what bracha do you make on the toitzah of the apple juice? A lesser bracha. Shakal, it's a lesser bracha than ha'etz. What bracha do you make on tomato juice? It's a lesser bracha than the tomato itself, which is adama. The only fruit that the toitzah is even more choshev than the fruit itself, that's the invei hagefen. For the grape, it's ha'etz. For the wine, it's hagofen. That's the pshat. Invei hagefen be'invei hagefen. That has always been the hope of Rabbi Yaakov Teitelbaum. Zecher Tzadik v'Kodesh Uvracha. Allowed Ben Chaim L'Chaim, and of course to Rav Shlomo. That all the children and all the grandchildren of this community that have ever grown up here should be even greater than their fathers and grandfathers. And that's the hope, and how can it be done? Only if it's Eitz Chaim Elam Al Zikinba. Maybe we should help from this Tu B'Shvat, that we should all make a Kabbalah, that just as in all the Eitz HaSodah, we have roots and we have parents, but we will not wither. The sap grows in today, the spiritual sap, the ruchniistic sap grows in today. David should help that we should fulfill our great potential. It should be invei hagefen be'invei hagefen. We should zeicha, we be zeicha. Rav Shlomo should lead us to Mashiach from Meir B'Yameinu.
I just want to make a correction in the pronunciation of the pasuk in Shemais Aleph pasuk Kof. The pasuk is Vayetev Elokim Lamayaldos. Many people say Vayitav. It's wrong. It's Vayetev Elokim Lamayaldos.